Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So in this video, I'm going to be going over my top 10 favorite fantasy books of all time. I would say for the most part, fantasy is my favorite genre. I do dabble in sci-fi, horror, and I do really like thrillers, but I think for the most part, fantasy is where I can actually just really escape, get away from my problems, and just really immerse myself into the world and get lost into the story. The only caveat to this list and the only rule that I put on myself for this list is only one book per author. Okay, so with that said, let's jump right into it. My number 10 favorite fantasy book of all time, Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames. Some fantasy books I go into not knowing a whole lot about, so my expectations are minimal. With this book, I went into it knowing that it had a lot of classic rock references to it. And for anyone who knows me, I'm an unabashed fan of classic rock. So I went into this book with the highest of expectations, and they were well met. Of course, that's not the only reason I liked the book, but it is a pretty good reason. The real reason why the book is on the list is because of the characters, Clay Cooper and the rest of the band of mercenaries. I think there were about 5, maybe 6 people in the band of mercenaries. My favorite, though, was Moog. He was straight up hilarious. For the most part, this is kind of a lighthearted, even pretty funny at times fantasy, but at some moments it can get a little dark and a little kind of sad. But at the end of the day, I just think it's a really fun adventure kind of fantasy with great characters and great for me because of all the classic rock references. Now I need to read the sequel, Bloody Rose, which I think follows more women characters this time, and instead of 70s music, now it's 80s music, which I also like. And my number 9 favorite fantasy book, 12 Kings and Sherikai by Bradley P. Bulio. This is a story about a woman named Cheda living in the grand desert city of Sherikai, who's looking to seek revenge against the kings. So like I said, this takes place in a desert city, which is very atypical when it comes to fantasy. Most of the time, you get sort of a medieval setting. And because of that, the world building felt very unique. Not really like anything that I've read before it. And most of the book is written from the main character's perspective of Cheda. And Cheda is probably one of my favorite female fantasy protagonists. We'll get to my favorite later on in the list. You do get other point of view chapters in this book, and they're also great too. Some people don't like a lot of flashbacks in their fantasy books, but I do, and this book definitely has some very cool, very interesting flashbacks for Cheda. I think it's also a very well-paced book. It's a little chunky, it's about 600 pages, but it reads very quickly. I'm also very anxious to continue with the series. So far, I've only read the first 2 books, and I've really enjoyed them, but I need to, keep going. And my number 8 favorite fantasy book of all time, Age of Myth by Michael J. Sullivan. I actually enjoyed this book so much that I've read it twice now, despite owning the first 5 books, and this is the only one I've read in the series. What is wrong with me? I like this book because it takes all the classic concepts of like classic old-time fantasy like you'll find in Lord of the Rings and all its copycats, but it takes more of a modern spin on it. It's also just a very funny and entertaining book. The premise of this book is that you've got these kind of godlike elven creatures who kind of look down upon what basically humans, and they're called runes in this story. And the runes basically believe that these elven type people are immortal. But in the first chapter, you've got this rune named Wraith, and he kind of just stumbles upon killing one of them, and it kind of sets everything in motion. And like most great fantasy works, as you get further into the story, you're introduced to a lot of different characters, and there's so many great characters that I love in this book. Probably my favorite character is Suri, who is kind of a younger girl, and she lives in the forest, and she's very well connected with nature, even to the point where she claims that she's able to talk with trees. And she also has her wolf companion, which is also a great touch. So when I first went into this book years ago, I kind of thought it was just going to be more of like a fun adventure kind of book. But there were some moments that kind of like took me off guard. I'm like, wait, did that actually happen? Like, what? And again, this is another series where I need to finish it because I've only read the first book, and it's a 6-book series, and why do I do this to myself? And my number 7 favorite fantasy book, City of Stairs by Robert Jackson Bennett. I went into this book knowing very little about it. The only things I knew were that it was a fantasy book and that it had a murder mystery element to it, which I thought was pretty intriguing. It's a book where you're constantly learning new information. You're constantly getting these epic revelations that are like, what is going on? It's definitely a page turner. It's only about 400 pages, and I read it probably in 2 days. I could not stop reading it. It's definitely a book that if you're really into conspiracy theories and finding out, like, is this the actual truth or is someone covering up stuff, then I think you would really like it, and of course I did. And the blurb on the back from Brent Weeks says that you guys are going to love Sigrid. And I did. I also like how, even though this is a trilogy, you can kind of read this as its own book. It's not quite a standalone, but like, it tells a complete story, which I really appreciate. Sometimes you get into a fantasy series and you read the first book and it ends and you're like, well, I have to read the second book. Not necessarily so with this series, but I do have books 2 and 3 and I'm very anxious to read them. And my number 6 favorite fantasy book of all time, The Drawing of the Three by Stephen King. This is the second book in the Dark Tower series, and definitely my favorite in the series. This is where the other characters that are going to be main characters in the series are introduced. Eddie and Susanna. I love this book because it's a great fish out of water story. Roland has to travel to find Eddie and Susanna, and him interacting with the people where they are and like the differences in culture basically is just hysterical. It also has just one of my favorite Stephen King characters of all time, Eddie. You delve into his past and where he is now, and I think that story is very compelling. Basically, Eddie is what Jesse Pinkman from Breaking Bad would look like if he grew up in the 80s. And for a Stephen King book, it's very well paced, which you don't always get with him. Alright, now we're into my top 5, and with my number 5 favorite fantasy book, The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. I actually just read this for the second time in February, and still loved it, obviously. There's a lot of reasons why I love this book. One of the reasons is that because it's Asian-inspired, and you don't typically see a lot of Asian-inspired fantasies. Typically, you see more European-inspired. The other main reason is simply because of the main character, Rin. Her character and her character arc that she goes through in this book and in the next book, Dragon Republic, is just terrific, and she's just a badass. I also think the pacing for this book is very unique. I think if any other epic fantasy writer were to try to write this story, they probably would have turned it into like a 1,000-page tome. But R.F. Kuang's writing style is very immediate. Like you see what you need to see, and then you move on. And even though this is only my number 5 pick, I would probably say that it has the best opening chapter of any fantasy book I read. When, like I said, when I reread it in February, after I read that first chapter, I was like, oh man, this is going to be so good. And this book gets very dark later on in the story. I'm not really one to be bothered by like gruesome violence. I love horror movies, right? But the things described in that particular chapter towards the end of the book, oh man, is rough. But that's the whole really point of the book and of the series, is to not glorify violence, not to glorify war. Because in a lot of fantasy books, you kind of get these heroes that like triumph and save the day, and there's not really a lot of, real consequences. But in real life, war has very real consequences, and in this story, you get all of that and more, and it's deeply disturbing. And like with a lot of the books on this list, I still haven't finished the series. I need to read the 3rd book, The Burning God. I do own it, I just need to get to it eventually. And I'm actually starting to realize that a lot of the books on this list are the first books in a series, which just goes to show you that I have a problem. And my number 4 favorite fantasy book of all time, Sword of Destiny by Andrei Sapkowski. Now, as we enter this part of the list, we're getting into books that could potentially make my top 10 favorite books list. Not even just fantasy books, just books in general. These are some of my favorite books of all time. I love the Witcher series, and by far this is my favorite in the series. I love short stories and novellas, and I actually think Sapkowski is a slightly better short story and novella writer, more so than his novel writing. Sword of Destiny contains 6 stories, and they're all immaculate. They all are very well paced, they have terrific payoffs, and just like I said with Sapkowski's writing, just very great character work. I'm actually going to be rereading this in April after I read The Last Wish in March. There's not too much more to say about this book. I recently made a ranking The Witcher series video, and I go a little bit more in depth about why this is my favorite in that video. Alright, now we're getting into top 3 territory. And my 3rd favorite fantasy book of all time is The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. I absolutely love this book. And my pitch for people who have never heard of it is if Tarantino directed a fantasy version of Ocean's 11. Mix all that together and you get The Lies of Locke Lamora. I'd say it's a pretty popular fantasy series, but for the people who don't like it, I think the main reason they don't like it is all of the flashbacks. It's a very non-linear way of telling the story. You get a chapter in present day, and then you get sort of an interlude that talks about the past, and as you get further into the story, you kind of see what Scott Lynch is trying to do with these flashbacks. For a lot of people, they either find that confusing or they don't find it compelling, but I loved it. It's also probably the funniest book on this list, even though it has some very dark moments. It's very humorous, and I think it's brought out brilliantly by the audiobook. And the audiobook narrator, Michael Page, does a very good job. I actually tried to read it physically the first time, and I was enjoying it, but I wasn't quite getting into it. But then I got the audiobook for it, and Michael Page's narration was just excellent. Unlike most of the books on this list, I've actually read the whole series, or at least what's out right now. It's a planned 7-book series, and only 3 of the books are out. I've read all of them. I've given them all 5 stars. It's one of my favorite fantasy series, but I especially like the first book the most. And my second favorite fantasy book of all time, The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. I feel like there's not too much I can bring to the table when it comes to Brandon Sanderson. A lot of people on BookTube love the man, love everything he's written, and I'd say for many fans, either Mistborn or The Way of Kings is probably their favorite fantasy book. The reason why The Way of Kings in particular is on this list, as opposed to some of the other Stormlight books, including Words of Radiance, which many people would put over this one, is simply just because it's the introduction to this brand new world of Roshar. Going back and experiencing this book almost like it was the first time, because I read this book pretty recently and I haven't really read it in at least 5 or 6 years. And also just going back and reading the character's story in this first book, knowing what I know about the first 3 books was just very fun. And of course, in many ways, this is Kaladin's book. A lot of the book is written from his perspective, and you get a lot of very cool flashbacks. But I really like Shallan's chapters, not because of like her character in particular, but because you also get a lot of Yasna, who's actually my favorite Stormlight character. I'm currently reading Rhythm of War right now for this month, and it's good so far, but I don't see it becoming better than Way of Kings. Even though I see a lot of people giving it high praise, I love Way of Kings so much. Even upon reread, my order is still the same. I like Way of Kings, Words of Radiance, Oathbringer. We'll see after I read Rhythm of War how I would rank them. But for now, Way of Kings is still my second favorite fantasy book, and probably just my second favorite book in general. So what's my number 1 pick? Well, and here it is, my number 1 favorite fantasy book of all time, and probably just my favorite book of all time. And it is Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin. Again, this is not an unpopular opinion by any means. It's probably the fan favorite of a very well-known fantasy series. A Song of Ice and Fire is definitely my favorite fantasy series of all time, and the 3rd book is obviously my favorite book in the series. And honestly, if I were making this list and I didn't have that caveat of having only 1 book per author, I'd probably put 2, 3, maybe even 4 of the books in the series in my top 10, but I mean, that wouldn't be fun. This book definitely has some of my favorite moments in all of A Song of Ice and Fire, and it has a lot of the, oh my god, did that actually just happen? What is going on type of moments. And if you've read the book, or if you've even watched the show, which the seasons 3 and 4 are essentially what make up the 3rd book. If you've seen those seasons, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I actually got into the books after I binge watched the first 4 seasons when they were out. I went and quickly read the books, and by the time I got to the 3rd book, I started noticing a lot more differences. And the epilogue to this book was definitely not in the show, and it freaked me out. I was like, whoa. And even though it's one of the longest books in the series, it's about 1,100 pages. Anytime I start reading it, I think I've read this book 2 or 3 times now. My copy's pretty beat up. I just fly through it. And A Song of Ice and Fire is obviously my favorite fantasy series of all time. So I do plan on rereading the series, including this book, over and over again for the rest of my life. And now we're all just patiently awaiting for Winds of Winter. Anyway, thanks for watching the video. What did you think of my list? Were there some of your favorite fantasy books in this list? Are there some books on this list that you just flat out don't like or that you're kind of meh about? Give me your top 10 list in the comments below. And of course, if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.